Everyone, welcome to our event today. I'm Pip McDonnell. I'm a Conservator and Research Fellow at Lincoln Conservation at the University of Lincoln, and I'm thrilled to introduce our event tonight. Just to let you know that the event will be recorded and we'll circulate the details of where this recording can be found as well if you want to watch it back or share it. So firstly, I'd like to thank the Art History Programme, the Global Transregional Studies Research Group and the Race, Ethnicity and Equality Committee and the School of History and Heritage from the University of Lincoln, especially Antonella, Laura and Sarah who've helped make this event happen. I'd also like to thank Burton Constable for their enthusiasm and cooperation in getting this event off the ground. And finally, this whole month of Black History events wouldn't be possible without Ben Ammon from the HR Equality and Engagement team. So thanks very much to him as well. So now I'd just like to introduce our wonderful speakers. So we have Michael Ohajuru, who's a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And an art and cultural historian with a passion for the Black presence in Renaissance Europe and in general, England in particular. He's also the project director of the John Blank Project, which if you haven't checked it out already, please go have a look at that. We've also got Malachi McIntosh, who writes fiction and non-fiction. He's the editor and publishing director of Wasafari, the magazine of international contemporary writing, and former co-lead and award-winning project Our Migration Story. We've got Akeim Toussaint, who sadly can't actually join us this evening due to illness, but he's a dancer, choreographer and musician and the founder of the dance company Toussaint to Move. Since graduating from Northern School of Contemporary Dance in 2014, Akeim's worked with numerous dance companies across the UK on a diverse range of projects. He was born in Jamaica and raised in England, and he's a multifaceted performing artist who seeks to create moving and thought-provoking, free-spirited and accessible projects. We also have Sarah Thomas with us, who is a senior lecturer in the history of art at Birkbeck in the University of London, and her research focuses on art history and museology of the British Empire and the visual representation of slavery and the cultural legacies of British slave ownership. And finally, we have Philippa Wood as well, who became the curator at Burton Constable Hall in East Yorkshire in 2018, and then went on to become the Historic Houses Scholar at Akeim Summer School in 2019. Her wide-ranging roles include curating exhibitions and interpretation, carrying out independent research, fundraising, and caring for the unique collections at Burton Constable. So this evening kind of came about through an object that we're conserving at Lincoln Conservation that's housed at Burton Constable. And it's a figurine depicting an enslaved figure. It's about 50 centimeters tall and is kind of bronze-colored plaster. This is actually based on a statue from Il Monumento de Quattro in Livorno in Italy, which in turn has statues based on real enslaved people who we incredibly actually have names for. One's called Ali and one's called Morgiano, hence the title of tonight's events. So this means that these objects are essentially portraits. So at Lincoln Conservation, we had questions about how or should Ali be conserved, and at Burton Constable equally had doubts about how to curate or even if to display it. So this gave us a fantastic opportunity to actually open a discussion and an exploration of the different approaches that could be gone down. So obviously the questions of how we do, can and should respond to imagery of enslaved figures in historic houses is a vast discussion point that will absolutely by no means be solved this evening. But we're trying to use the figure of Ali at Burton Constable in order to kind of give us a bit of a focus point and a bit of grounding throughout this session. So also one of the main things that we were keen to explore was the importance not just of an historic and traditional sort of curatorial explanation of the figure, but and the monument and the statues of Morgiano as well, but also how like creative responses could be used to encourage empathy and bring these stories that they hold to life in a really sort of human way. So that's why this evening is going to be a mix of history, heritage, performance, and then finally a panel discussion. So firstly, Philippa will give us an introduction to the historical context of the sculpture of Ali and introduce the modern challenges and opportunities faced by objects like these in historic houses. We'll then jump straight into the creative responses that have been specifically commissioned to respond to Ali and Morgiano. So first we'll hear a short story from Malachi, and then we'll hear a music performance which has been pre-recorded by Akeim. And Michael is going to ask some questions to Malachi about the process of this performance to kind of understand where he comes from this from a creative point of view. The music piece recorded by Akeim is actually part of a larger dance performance piece that's going to be showcased at a separate event. So please keep your eyes peeled for promotion of that as well. After that, we'll take a short break to give everyone a chance to sort of let those performances sink in. And we'd also really like you to sort of think of some questions which you would like to ask our panelists in the second half. So the second half will be mostly a panel discussion where Philippa and Malachi are going to be joined by Sarah. And the discussion is going to be led by the ever brilliant and capable Michael. So in thinking of the question of how we should respond to imagery of enslaved people in historic houses, it's important to point out that we don't actually know these answers yet. And so this is why we really wanted to make it a conversation between the panelists and between you, the audience, as well. So throughout the event, we'll have some polls and some other questions for you to anonymously participate in, if you like. And there's always as well the Q&A function, which should be the speech bubble that should be at the bottom of your screens. It might be different if you're on a mobile device. And this is where you can ask panelists some questions directly. So please don't be shy. Please ask questions. We might not have time to get around to them all, but if you don't ask, you won't get an answer. So just to kind of test that technology is on our side and to get people used to this, we're going to do a quick practice poll and a quick practice word cloud. So Rachel, if you could pop a poll up for me. So you now should get a little pop-up screen. So you should just click that. Great, everyone seems to be sort of happy with that one. And if we just pop up one of the introduction polls as well. Great. So if people could just answer this poll as well. So this is what it'll be like. We'll occasionally do these throughout, so it should be nice and straightforward, and hopefully that's all kind of working for you. Right, so I'll just end that poll and we'll be able to see the results. So this should be really interesting, hopefully, to see some of the differences throughout the event as well. So a lot of you have attended Black History Month event before, but a lot of you haven't. So welcome, and I'm glad you're coming along to ours, and hopefully we can do it justice as the first one you've been to. We should also occasionally have a word cloud question as well, which should pop up, and that should just be a little QR code that you can scan with your phone, and that should take you to an external website, and you'll just be able to pop in a word as well. So without further ado, I will also, if you do have any technical issues, please just pop a comment to us and we'll get that sorted. But most things can be fixed by logging off and logging on again. So now I think I'll pass over to Philippa Wood, who's going to give us an introduction to Ali.
Hi, Pip, and thanks for that introduction. That's very nicely done. And thank you also for mentioning technical problems, because I'm afraid I have on my end been having a few technical issues which the panelists know about already, which is why instead of giving a live presentation now, you're about to hear my backup, which was a recording of my presentation, which I made earlier. So I hope you enjoy. And in advance, I am not a native Italian speaker, I'm afraid. So if I mispronounce anything, then I do apologize. I am going to experiment with sharing my screen. Okay, and hopefully you should be able to hear this. Hopefully one of the other panelists will let me know if there's any issues.
Hello and welcome. As you've just heard, I'm Philippa Wood, the curator at Burton Constable Hall. I'll start with a brief disclaimer to this session that I'm a relative newcomer to the schools of discussion we're entering today. With a background in archaeology and museum studies, I became curator at the Hall 3 years ago. My knowledge of the very extensive field of art history and indeed of colonial studies is therefore limited, and I'm delighted and honoured to have the opportunity to appear alongside this panel of experts today to talk about the copy of Pietro Tacca's Monumento di Quattro Mori that has called Burton Constable home for the last 300 years. I'm going to begin by giving a brief contextual overview of the history of Burton Constable, of Pietro Tacca himself, and of the city in which he was creating the Quattro Mori. I'll then go on to look at how the original sculpture influenced souvenirs of the Grand Tour in the 18th and 19th century, and at the background of our own copy. I'll finish by looking at why we've begun this conservation project and why we were so delighted to be offered the opportunity to take part in this event as part of Lincoln University's Black History Month events. So, a very brief understanding of where it is that the statue calls home. Burton Constable is an Elizabethan country house, which was originally a defensive moated peel tower protecting a medieval village. It saw huge expansion from the 1560s, marking the family's new stature and, alas, enclosing the deserted medieval village of the serfs and villeins who formerly farmed the new parkland. This work continued throughout the early and mid-1600s, around the time, coincidentally, that a sculptor named Pietro Tacca was rising to prosperity in the employ of the Medici Grand Dukes in Florence, Italy. Pietro Tacca was born in 1577 in Carrara, training on marble. During his teens, he moved to Florence to continue training under Gian Bologna, chief sculptor for the Medici family. He became the head apprentice at the workshop, and after the head sculptor's retirement was the obvious choice as successor. He took on Gian Bologna's workshop, serving under the Grand Dukes de' Medici, and in the 1620s was commissioned to create the Quattro Mori to sit around the base of an existing statue commemorating Ferdinand I de' Medici, who led a rather distinguished military career. The Quattro Mori are perhaps one of Tacca's most famous works, despite the longevity of his career. Livorno in the early 17th century was a rapidly growing city. In 1622, at around the time the Quattro Mori sculpture was commissioned, around 10% of the city's population was comprised of enslaved persons. New captives, seized largely during military activity on land or sea, were held in the Bagno, or royal prison. In truth, slave labour had helped to build the prison and much of the city it stood in. While some captives were given some amount of freedom and were even allowed to run stalls in the market, they were rarely allowed to go out unrestrained. Many of the prisoners were indeed used to row the barks belonging to their captors, often into battle, at which more slaves were captured. Huge numbers of captives were brought into the city. After only one battle, over 2,000 persons were enslaved. The initial Quattro Mori sculpture was commissioned to celebrate these great military victories over what were then termed Barbary pirates and Ottoman Turks. We have detailed resources which record that Pietro Tacca went to significant troubles to ensure that his sculptures represented real persons. He had been carrying out studies of models from the Bagno as early as 1607, perhaps for other works that he did within his portfolio. But for this work he focused mainly on two men in particular, Morgiano and Ali, who were very helpfully described by people recording Tacca's work, either around the time that the works were created or with perhaps slightly less certainty about a century after. One apocryphal story, incidentally, tells that Tacca sent both men free once his commission was complete in thanks for their services, and that Morgiano frequently brought his sons to the square to show off his likeness. Alas, no original source for this story has yet been discovered by myself, but it certainly must be said that the way in which Tacca handled this representation of enslaved persons was decidedly unusual for the time. The sculptures show unusual level of detail in the models' faces. They have a much greater level of individuality and identity, which weren't really seen on other works from this period. There's a lack of conformity to the generalized ethnic types that were often seen in sculptures of the time, and these features perhaps led to the immediate popularity of the sculptures for copies and, later, for adaptations. The sculpture was being reproduced in bronze for miniature works less than 50 years after the original sculpture was put in place, and the piece influenced work by other artists. Pietro Tacca's son, indeed, was responsible for some original copies, with Giovanni Battista Foggini taking on this mantle after Ferdinando's death, and broadening the representations to an enormous degree, until the point where you start to get representations of slaves of the four continents. Back home, here in England at Burton Constable, after the mid-17th century, Burton Constable Hall's development had almost stopped. In 1747, however, William Constable inherited the hall and began major renovations of both the house and the landscape. William considered himself to be a man of virtue and sought culture and learning, eventually setting out on a grand tour rather late in life and, unusually, with his sister Winifred. By the time of William's grand tour, copies were starting to be made more numerously in plaster and ceramics. These would have been available obviously in Italy itself, but would also have been available through agents by what is essentially mail order to the UK. It is therefore entirely possible that the sculpture might actually have reached Burton Constable before William even set foot on Italian soil. Despite the craze for souvenirs of this work, there were already some notable complainants about the sculpture's subjects quite early on. As early as 1799, only 20 years after William's tour ended, General Sextius Alexandre Francois Miollet, who controlled this region following the Napoleonic Wars, condemned the statue severely. He described the work as a monument to tyranny, insulting humanity, saying that feelings of pain, scorn, contempt, and hatred should disturb every sensible soul when looking at it. He even called for a movement to avenge the injury done to humanity, and yet, curiously enough, maintained Ferdinand I's sculpture after removing it from its plinth, and never touched the Quattro mori at all. After a short time, the sculpture was reinstated in full. It was a short-lived protest. In the mid-1800s, however, the piece still had its critics. Author Stendhal stated rather mildly that it was truly a poor idea to surround a prince with the eternal image of pain, while American artist Rembrandt Peale went further and branded the monument disgusting. William's grand tour cost £7,315, a small fortune at the time. William suffered from gout, so this trip was primarily a tour seeking medical assistance, with a secondary purpose of seeking out as many enlightened gentlemen and as many objects of high culture or science as possible. Despite the fact that Winifred Constable kept a diary of their travels, it largely related to William's state of health, meaning that it's impossible to know whether the pair ever went near Livorno at all, or indeed the Quattro mori. In 1771 the pair returned home. No vouchers from that time record the sculpture at the heart of this event being purchased. An inventory created in 1791, the year of William's death, curiously enough records the house as containing 3 slaves, not 1. The creator of this particular sculpture remains a mystery, although we have 3 very similar works which can be clearly attributed to John Cheer. No documentation or maker's marks exists to identify this piece as being by Cheer. Following William's death, the ownership of Burton Constable Hall eventually passed to Sir Thomas Aston Clifford Constable and his wife Lady Mary Ann. Interestingly enough, Sir Thomas Aston Clifford Constable was not only a man who did not own slaves, but one who even petitioned for the abolition of slavery in the 1830s, shortly before slavery was indeed made illegal. William Wilberforce, largely credited as being a leading figure in the abolition movement, did actually come from the very nearby city of Hull, and may therefore have been a social acquaintance. Despite Sir Thomas's apparent distaste for the practice of slavery, the chained captive sculpture remained at the hall during this time, and was recorded in the staircase hall in an 1841 study of the house as being a slave bound, subjected to torture. It's believed that the chained captive and the other similar items in the hall were regilded during this period, meaning that they clearly weren't items that were being shunned due to their subject matter. In 2018, it was decided that this piece should be made a conservation priority, with work finally beginning on the piece thanks to support from the Association of Independent Museums. The captive has not been on display to the public within living memory. With its poor condition, it was instead safely placed in the Foundation's geology store. There was surface damage across the item, one arm was missing, and numerous fractures were evident across the piece. You'll be hearing more about the conservator's findings and works, however, from Philippa from Lincoln Conservation, so I'll move on swiftly. Sending the piece to Lincoln Conservation has sparked a debate around how we will display and interpret this fascinating but challenging piece of artwork upon its return. The Hall does not, on the whole, use a great deal of written interpretation. While information folders are available, COVID permitting, not all visitors wish to read them. Our volunteer house guides, though brilliant, cannot be everywhere at once, and we do not wish to interfere with our current aim to display the house as a family home by putting up large sheets of information around individual items on a long-standing basis. So we need to look at how we can engage our audience fully with this newly conserved item from our collections, and how to approach the contested histories it represents. Another challenge we have to face up to is around how to handle discussions around the relevance of this item, and around whether we should be displaying it at all. The original sculpture was, in June 2020, the focus of Black Lives Matter protests in Livorno, and was threatened with damage in much the same way as Bristol's statue of Colston was. Clearly the original sculpture, and therefore this piece, are highly relevant and topical to serious and wide-ranging debates in society today. And as curator, it falls largely to my lot to decide to what level we engage with these debates and how we approach them. We are astonishingly lucky in that the chained captive sculpture represents our only easily recognisable link with the slave trade. The Constable family are not known to have been slave owners at any time, and certainly did not receive any remuneration after the abolition of slavery. We certainly have furniture made from woods that would have been sourced from slave-managed plantations, but then it would be extremely difficult to find any historic properties that do not. And of course, this aspect of the slave trade is one to which our visitors will rarely pay much attention in the course of an average visit. One might, I suppose, draw a parallel with modern homes and modern shoppers. It's very likely that most British people who have bought clothing from cheap clothes outlets might have purchased things created in sweatshops, using what is essentially modern slave labour, as uncomfortable as that is for us to have to consider. Indeed, even in the modern age, slavery is very much an ongoing concern, and one that happens a lot more invisibly than might perhaps have been the case in 18th century Livorno, or indeed 17th century Livorno. It's important to consider the differences between the sort of slavery practiced in Italy at this time, where the prisoners were very often taken during battle and were rarely captured from their home territories, and the difference between this to transatlantic slave trade, where the methods and outcomes were very often very different. This is perhaps a topic that is rarely explored as fully as might be. It's an extremely wide-ranging debate, and the Burton Constable Foundation has no fixed standing from which to launch upon this very different sphere of discussion. So we're really grateful to the University of Lincoln and Lincoln Conservation for helping to arrange this forum in which to explore such subject and challenges. We wish to really engage with the members of the public and our visitors to understand better their views on this subject once we put this object back on display in the hall. We want to understand how modern-day viewers view the sculpture. A simple glance at TripAdvisor reveals that differences on the views on the original sculpture differ hugely, with some people calling it an atrocity or disgusting or disturbing, while others simply see it as an interesting point to see on their trip around the city. How will visitors around Burton Constable perceive this much smaller version of that same sculpture? I think it's going to be a very interesting topic to look at as we move into the future. And it will be very interesting to hear the thoughts of our speakers and indeed of the audience when it comes to the panel discussion later today. For the moment, I just want to say thank you for listening to this talk. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this session. Thank you again to all who have taken part in it.
And that's the end of the talk. I've just got a little bit of information up there for people watching. I believe we have time for some questions, Pip.
Yeah, I think we've got some poll question to ask people. So again, we've just got a quick one just to get your immediate response from that, because again, we want this to be sort of a bit of a dialogue, so we want kind of your reaction from this. So I think we should have the first question up now, so people should be seeing that. So if you kind of put your response to that, and then we can use these to kind of go in a bit more in depth about these in the panel discussion. Just leave this up for a couple more seconds. Great. So if we just share these results. Okay, so yeah, so there's some people that have seen this addressed in historic houses, and some who haven't as well. So again, that's something that will be interesting to discuss later. And I think we have another question to ask as well for that. So if we get that one up too. Okay, so another one, would you feel comfortable asking a room steward or museum staff for more information about this object if you were to come across it in Burton Constable? Okay, we'll leave this up for a couple more seconds. So, and yeah, and let's share the results of this. So actually a lot of you would feel comfortable, which is fantastic, which is really great, which is what we want. And if that's no, then that's something we can explore as well in the discussion. So again, we'll just ask one more as well. I think we shared the results of that. Okay, and finally, do you think changing the curating practices around Black and ethnic minority history will attract different or new audiences wishing to engage in historic houses? Great. Okay, and if we just share those the results of that as well. So yeah, so we've got again majority yes, but also some no's in there. So again, thank you guys. This is really useful to get this this information. It's going to be really good to sort of discuss this later as well. I think that might be all of them, or do we have one more? We have one more question as well that we'll just ask before we dive straight into the creative responses as well. So as Philippa mentioned, Ali and Morgiano are unusual and they show individualistic representations of enslaved people and not just stereotypes. Do you think this adds to sort of like the trauma of the piece? So, and again, we'll give you a couple more seconds. Okay, right, and we'll end that and share that with you. So again, some yes and some no's there as well. And again, this will be great sort of to talk about later. So I think that's those questions that we have for there. So we will move on to Malachi if you're ready, and if you could introduce the piece for us. And I'll turn my camera off now. So.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Philippa is the only person I can see on screen. So if you could give a thumbs up if you can hear me, brilliant.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks.
Perfect. So firstly, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, Pip in particular, to participate in this, which is, in my experience, at least a very unique event engaging with this issue of statues of enslaved people, of national trusts, properties, historic houses, etc. In that not only is it inviting creative responses, but also inviting an audience to give their input and having, I hope, the interaction between both the panelists and the audience influenced the practice of the house, which I'm really excited about for part 2 to see how that works. The thing that I've written, the organizers have kindly made a visual aid for it, but actually I'm going to ask them not to play that visual aid, and I would like just to read it. And I want you to, as audience members, although I can't see you, just interact with and engage with this piece however it makes most sense to you. I most recently saw a poet who invited the audience to close their eyes and listen to his reading, which was quite a unique experience. I'm someone who writes very much for the page, not really that much of someone who writes and reads out my creative work. And this is written in a kind of way that some aspects of it I think won't necessarily translate, but hopefully the gist of it works in this medium. I would say too, and hopefully we can come back to this in discussion about the piece and later on, that's just particularly hard to write, and I don't think I've quite nailed it. I think this is a few drafts away from being where I would want it to be. So that might be something to bear in mind. It might not be. But anyway, it's called Colossi. His first thought when he saw the bodies was that everyone was going to get sick. How couldn't they? Bodies pressed into and over each other and so closely blended into one single thing, broken only by banners, by slogans. Stop killing Black people, say his name, we will not be silent. They'd get sick. Love Black lives the way you love Black culture. Racism is a pandemic. The UK is not innocent. They'd get sick. Then that actor from the new Star Wars working himself into tears and speaking with passion undermined by cliches. Respect Black women. Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. Then everyone sharing the video he didn't want to watch. The knee on the neck, 8 minutes, 9 minutes, whatever it was. The life crushed out of this man in broad daylight as he knew. Everyone knew. He cried out for his mother, Mama. He watched the comedian in America who named his set after the exact amount of time it took for the man to die. Not one real joke in the whole thing. He saw the protests in Germany, in Italy, in New Zealand, in the Netherlands, in Canada, in Sudan, in Israel, and Denmark. He heard the names, the incantations of names, the names, names, and names. Some you'd just catch once, some you'd hear again and again, and all he could think, and he felt ashamed by it, was, they'll get sick. They'll get sick, and then they'll say, you see them? They get sick. The reason we're sick is because they're sick. They'll get sick, and that would be the end of it. And then his son cried out. Then, whenever was then, all the times that were then, all the days just one day now, all the nights like just one long night. When his son cried out, the only thing there was space for, the only thing that the world was the fact that his son was crying, that again he was crying, that again he couldn't sleep. But when the father's mind found a moment, sometimes many hours later, sometimes staring in the dark at the ceiling, when it found a moment again to reopen, he thought, they'll get sick, they'll get sick. Please God, just don't get sick. Please God, just get through this. He still wakes up at 5 a.m., the boy, still wakes up sometimes screaming. His father hears him now and rolls over to check the time, 5:05, which is better than the wake time yesterday, but worse than last week. He's often these days thinking in this way. The food on the floor was less than last month. Getting him into the bath was worse than 2 days ago, but much better than it was when he was a baby. It's easier to change him now, and sometimes he can tell you when he's going and that he's going when he's going, which is good for his age. He knows colors, can count to 3, but often confuses white and yellow and says, 1, 2, 1, 3. Had you asked the father what fatherhood would be like before he became a father, he would have said it would be hard. Fathering without having been fathered properly yourself. When you dreamed what you'd be in life was something very different, something else. Fathering now in this world, as it was, where it was going. He mainly cast his imagination forward back then when his wife was pregnant. Imagine himself with a much older child, not a baby or a toddler, or he still doesn't know which age is what, the various names for the various stages, but maybe with a 6-year-old, and that 6-year-old doting on him. Most often when he imagined them together, him and his son, he would see the kid trailing him in a hooded jacket, the two of them walking into the city center, rounding the corner from their flat toward the world. In those dreams, the kid would be perfectly content in his father's company, but always faceless, because it was too early then to conceive of faces. But he was obviously, in the father's mind, he was still obviously happy. Not beaming, but happy. And yet still he'd think, the father, this is going to be too hard. I don't know if I can do this. His son is still screaming. Awake, the boy says, lights on in his room. The father in his boxer shorts and t-shirt, rubbing his eyes. You're awake, he says. Awake, me! Not daddy, the father says with a yawn. Not daddy, no. Then the boy waits and thinks. Yeah, he says, daddy, awake. Are you awake? The father asks. Awake. What follows then runs a bit like a machine. The two of them knowing the roles, shared breakfast, 10 minutes with the kid with toys while his father runs the bath, the television on to news while they eat together, the boy practicing all the names he has for things. Car, roof, toast, daddy, me. As on screen protests, brush fires, bodies, hurricanes, police cars slammed into teenagers holding only white signs for protection as the father reaches to change the channel, and politicians stand at mics, at lecterns, and his son says, bath daddy, no, no. He's in a WhatsApp group of old university friends called Is It, which until this year was a place for bad jokes, meetup arrangements, memes, and the occasional baby picture, then turned at first into a space to check in and express hope and concern, then turned further, opened out into what it is now, something like a second, tighter, and more painful Twitter feed of links to newspaper articles and think pieces, recommendations of books to read, and quotations from James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. His white friends on it, slowly, went silent. And he doesn't know if this was because they didn't like it, felt they couldn't comment on it, or something worse. Doesn't know if they'd created or already had their own spaces. He wouldn't know, except for posts on other sites, that they're all even okay. At the beginning of all this, he sent a lot of out of the blue messages, DMs to people he'd been following or friends with, but who he hadn't exchanged real words with in years. He made the effort to properly reconnect with exes, apologetically, saying he was sorry, and it was strange, but everything was strange now, and were they okay? He wondered when he wrote if they thought of him as often as he thought of them, in the same ways, but he couldn't type that. And after the initial relieved exchanges, the efforts to rekindle old jokes, exhume the shared past that was always there, but then also always wasn't. The relationships with the exes, with the distant friends, returned to their steady state of silence and distance watching, and his son was bored or crying and needed his care. Right now, he's working one of the 3 rooms where he spent the whole last year, more or less. Work open in 4 of the 6 windows on his desktop, not work running in the rest. On Is It yesterday, someone posted a link to an opinion piece and quoted a line from it, which said, slavery and empire are 2 quite different things, and then wrote, WTF, LOL, SMH. When the father read it, the byline, and saw the byline and the author picture, it was clearly written by the kind of guy whose sole job it is to write that kind of article. But still, on Twitter, today, in one of his non-work windows, is an unfolding scroll of people arguing about the article, attacking and defending the author and the place it was published. And this now seems to happen whenever things like this happen, talking about Winston Churchill. It's a bad thing for cultures to mix, someone writes. To improve is to change, to be perfect is to change often, Winston Churchill, someone writes. This is literally why Churchill said, if you're going through hell, keep going, someone writes. Why are you campaigning for whitewashing and cultural amnesia, someone writes. This would be funnier if it wasn't so pathetic, someone writes. In his other non-work window is a web app with picture updates from his son's nursery. They're painting today, and the kid's got red paint on his face, red paint on his new gray joggers. Looks like he's having a lot of fun. On Twitter, someone writes, "I'm a Black man and I love Mr. Churchill. You lot need to grow up," with 4 exclamation points. 3 people write about how other people need to get out of their echo chambers. A colleague emails him, urgent, and then the day is gone. The father collects his son. His son wakes up at 5:10 the next morning, which is better than the day before. And his son says, "Awake!" At drop off that morning, it's the same bubbly nursery lady he sees every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. She's dressed in the same purple tunic that they all wear there, the corporate nursery logo stitched over her heart. He knows her name, but never feels he knows her well enough to use it, to even enter into the kind of conversation where you might need to use it, even though she and others, whose names he also never uses, have been looking after his son for the better part of a year. She's overbright, bursting, he would describe her as. Speaks in that high, soft, slow, and excited way that young kids seem to like, but his son seems ambivalent about. And she greets him, the father, always as Dad, as in, "Morning, Dad," she says, and stoops down to his son. "And good morning, you. Any messages?" she asks. Her blue eyes raised above her mask, her red hair roughly ponytailed. He couldn't actually say much about this woman, would struggle to identify her outside of this context. Her accent is Midlands-ish. Her height is average. There are pictures of her without a mask on the nursery website, but in real life, he's never actually seen the bottom half of her face. Early on, very early on, when his son was just 11 months old, he got a sense that this woman didn't like him, his son. She looked at the boy the way the father's teachers used to look at him in school, and he told his wife, I don't know. You think he's racist? He's just a baby," his wife said. "I don't know," the father said. "I just want him to be treated the same as the other children." "He will be," his wife said. Then she didn't speak for a very long time before she said, like an echo, at the volume of an echo, "He'll be fine." And she was fine, this woman, overall, as fine as anyone else with the boy. He was cute, he won most people over, but with the father himself, it always felt different. No messages," he says. "Okay, then brilliant. Come on in then, you," she says to the boy. Online, everyone's still writing about Churchill. They've boarded up a statue of him to protect against vandalism, and a group of BNP or EDL or NF or whatever they are now members are trying to organize 24-hour protection. They have one of them on BBC News in a clip everyone's circulating, saying the way that some people are treating our country is a disgrace. Someone remixes it. Someone posts a fake video of the remix and rickrolls it. Someone writes about how the rickroll is a nostalgic callback to the pre-pandemic era. Someone adds a post about that to Is It. The father ends up following a chain of videos on YouTube, ends up on one called, quote, "Statues of slaveholders you didn't know you were seeing." Someone posting in the comments that all images of, in all caps, enslavers need to come down. Someone else writing, "Who should we make statues of then? Slaves?" Someone else writing that most of the people achieve more in life than you ever will. Someone else writing, "And probably more than you will too." On the weekends, he takes his son for long walks. His son on foot for as long as he can manage, then lifted into his pushchair and wheeled with the pace picked up. There are so many beautiful parts of Birmingham that even he didn't know existed. They sit together in the Vale and feed the ducks. They do laps of Cannon Hill. He can't, the father, remember what it was like to be a boy. Most of his memories are so merged with images from photo albums, he's not sure anymore if they even count as memories. So far as he has anything, he has feelings of warmth with his parents, of joy on his bicycle, of fear in the cinema when someone, he doesn't know whose idea it was, but his own father was present. When someone took him to see a horror film when he was far too young. It all seems soaked in sepia, his childhood, a past almost too perfect. "Tree," his son says now. "Car," he says. "Crane, crane." He read when his son was young, and he'd read anything, everything, to give him advice on what to do. A blog that said the biggest challenge as a new parent was to feel the joy and awe for your children when they're awake that you feel for them when you see them sleeping. He didn't get that initially, but now he does. He does feel it, both joy and awe, not always, but in moments that swell up in him out of nowhere, almost out of thin air. It's what he feels about himself as a child, both joy and awe, the impossibility of it, that state of being largely untouched until you are. Doggy, car, birds. He's thought a lot about the coming conversation, wondering when it will happen and how. Are we, the son might say, or someone at school called me, or because we're, does that mean that? And he doesn't know what to say to respond. What he could say, he thinks, now, having walked a tour through streets and trees, the sun calling out the names of everything that he knows. He stands now with his son outside of a hotel, in front of a statue of a man he'd never seen, but that's cemented there, his stone eyes cast to the horizon, arms spread, two women draped at his feet. The plaque reads, below the man, he labored to bring freedom to the Negro slave, the vote to British workmen, and the promise of peace to a war-worn world. And what would he say, the father? What will he say? What will I say? Dada, birds, birds, car. His first thought when he saw the bodies was that everyone was going to get sick. How couldn't they? Bodies pressed into and over each other, and so close, they blended into one single thing, broken only by banners, by slogans. Stop killing Black people. Say his name. We will not be silent. They'd get sick. Love Black lives the way you love Black culture. Racism is a pandemic. The UK is not innocent. Then that actor, the one from the new Star Wars, working himself into tears and speaking with passion undermined by cliches. Respect Black women. Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. Then everyone sharing the video he didn't want to watch. The knee on the neck, 8 minutes, 9 minutes, whatever it was. The life crushed out of this man in broad daylight as he knew, everyone knew. He cried out for his mother, Mama. His son cries out. He checks the time. In his son's bedroom, in his boxer shorts, the father rubs his eyes. Awake. That's it.
Thanks, Malachi. That was amazing. It's always weird reading to no audience. I'm sure everyone's like giving their response in the background, so that's really strange that there's no kind of like reaction back to you. But thank you so much for that. That must have been like you were saying, it was really challenging to write. Before Michael asks you more about your process of writing, I'd just like to get a kind of to give you a bit of an audience reaction. We've got a word cloud where people can give their responses. So I think we're just going to pop that up on screen now. That should magically appear in a second. Here we go. So if people just scan that QR code with their phone or go onto the website and enter this code, it should give you a question. Then we'll just about your response to Malachi's story, and then we can respond back to that. So we'll give you a minute or so to do that, if that's all right. I think we're actually having some technical difficulties with getting to the question. So, oh, there we go. Yeah, I don't think it actually, oh, here we go. So you should be able to now enter a word about how the story made you feel, and we'll get some more feedback from that.
It feels eerily like being on the X Factor, where people are supposed to call in and vote for you or something. You just have to wait patiently, smiling on stage.
Yeah. Okay, we'll give that a couple more seconds. Oh yeah, so we're getting lots of similar ones here, sort of move, powerful, tense, reflective, empathy, hopeful, caring. So I think that seems to have settled itself down a little bit. If we could then just move on to the next question quickly, and then we'll go on to Michael asking some actual questions rather than weird X Factor style ones. I think so that should come up in a second. Ready? Oh, there we go. So if everyone does the same thing as before. And again, it should be able to ask some questions in a second. Here we go. So there's just a bit of a delay on it. So again, if everyone thinks there's some sort of the words and themes that came from that story that really resonated with you as well. Okay. Yeah, so we're getting again a lot of the sort of similar father-son relationship, awake, talk, car, sick, mama, daddy. Yeah, there's some like really interesting point that people have picked up on. And I am now going to move back to Malachi and move on to Michael as well to ask more about your process of actually writing that, and if those sort of like theme words were the sort of the themes that you wanted to carry across, and what your ideas of that were as well. So I'll now pass you over into Michael's hands.
Hi, Malachi. Thank you for that. That was well, the words almost said they're powerful, moving, emotional. I was there were so many parts to the text that really moved me. But I'd like to first take you on that journey, that mental journey, the emotional journey, from the sculpture, from that the drawn picture, the image of Ali, to your son, and your idea of how he inspired your relationship with your son, because that was very clear. That was a key part of the story. So take us on that journey from the image or the object to the relationship.
Yeah, I can try. I mean, I would say that's not me. So the story's not about me. Although I guess it kind of scatters some autobiographical elements into it. I live in Birmingham. It's like Birmingham. The main character has a son. I have a son. My son goes to nursery. The son of the story goes to nursery. My son lots of children go to nursery. But beyond that, the experience described isn't quite my experience of pandemic era, and it's actually quite different from my experience. But I guess journey-wise, so this is the second commission that I've had to write a story about a national trust property, effectively. I'm one of the commission authors for the upcoming Colonial Countryside collection, which is edited by Karen Fowler, who's the person who from time to time gets attacked in the press for, you know, debasing the history of the National Trust or whatever. And for that project, I wrote about a place called Cock Abbey. And I mention that because the experience of writing that piece is very similar to this one, in that in both cases, I tried to write a piece of historical fiction. That's what I really wanted to do. And I didn't manage it for the previous one. So I said, this time, writing about National Trust properties, history is the thing at stake. I want to write something set in the past. And Pip, who's our MC, I guess, really kindly forwarded me lots of research articles about the Tacca sculpture. And I sort of dove into that and tried to find as much information as I could. And then I tried to, approach it from that perspective, and that really quickly failed. So this commission was, you know, commissioned 6 months ago, 7 months ago, maybe even more, maybe beginning of the year. I don't remember the timeline exactly. So I've been working on this for a little while. I tried a just straight historical fiction approach, and it just fell apart. I couldn't get anywhere with it. Trying to write about someone going to this place, the Bagno, to do a sculpture of a slave, and I just didn't, or an enslaved person. It just couldn't make it work. And anyone on the call who does creative work probably has had that experience where, you know, you're working on something and you're just like, this isn't the one. So then I thought, let me do satirical historical fiction. So I tried to do something where all the people in the town were like called into the square after the big battle, and the generals were announcing that, you know, they're going to do a monument to celebrate their victory. And then they asked the people what they wanted to do the monument of, and they decided to do a monument of an enslaved person. And I thought it was pretty fun, and I haven't written satire in a very long time, and proceeded there. And it didn't work. And I said, oh, let me try to write it from the people's perspective. So the first line, which I thought was very cool, was we were tired of monuments. And I tried to run with that, but that too ran out of steam. So I said, let's flip it and make it satirical from the perspective of like the general. So the first line for that story is, we need more monuments, which I thought also was super clever. But that didn't work either. And I think not to go on for ages, I think I'm probably not that interested in statues, historical statues of enslaved people or enslavers, which is weird for me to be here. And it was really only the process of writing that I got to that. What I'm interested in are the effects and the instrumentalization of those things in the present. And as I was writing toward the thing itself, just the idea of creating a monument to whatever, I ran out of steam because I don't care really. People make monuments. I'm with Gary Young that we need less of them. Maybe you don't need any of them. What mattered to me was the human story. And again, in an early conversation Michael we had about this event, he said, you know, why is this stuff important now? And that story of, is it Morgiano? That probably apocryphal story of him bringing his family to see his sculpture after he had been manumitted, so after his freedom was returned to him, really stuck with me. And I thought that's where the story is. Like, what would it be? What would it mean to be, you know, that person bringing your family to see that? And I tried to do something with that. I didn't get there. And I thought, well, what would it be? What is it for us as Black people, as non-white people now in Britain, to be confronted with these images and to live alongside them? And for them constantly to be kind of presented to us and thrown in our faces, and people saying like, what do you think about this? What does this mean to you, etc. That is where the story was. So that's when I finally got something I could work with.
So it was the idea of the slave depicted, bringing his family to look at him, and he had some sense of pride and honor in it, that inspired you to take it forward and to have that relationship between the father and son. And again, at the start of the story, you had this sense of, it's quite dark in terms of the sickness, you know, the pervasive sickness. And I said, it took me a while to pick up, this is COVID you're talking about here. Am I right? In terms of that pervade, those opening scenes.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I guess I'm trying to be a bit clever, who knows, to make sickness do double duty there. So, you know, pandemic, but also something bigger, perhaps. the fear that they'll get sick, the fear that, you know, somehow the surrounding context will infect everyone and disable them, I guess, is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
There was a couple of relationships there I want to explore with you. But one was the nursery nurse, in terms of, am I reading too much into it? You as a father were concerned about your son leaving with her, and the fact that she was white and your son was black, or the son, not your son, the son was black. There's some issues there that need to be addressed, need to be looked at.
Yeah, I guess so. I was thinking about this morning, just talking well throughout the day. And I guess an example I've given to people before, and I don't know if it's evident to everybody, but my experience of being Black in Britain and in the US, where I spent a good chunk of my life, hence my accent, is that it's something that is, you don't really think about, right? You think about your Blackness the same way you might think about, you know, being somebody who supports a football team or likes a certain kind of food, like a Cornish pasty. Like if you're a Cornish pasty lover, you don't wake up every day and look in the mirror and say, I love Cornish pasties. What am I going to do today? You just wake up and you kind of get on with your life. But there are certain times when that aspect of your identity is sort of thrown forward, right? For the most part, you don't look at yourself and say, I am a Black person. What is me as a Black person going to do with my day today? You just kind of have stuff to do. You got emails to return. You're a bit tired. You stubbed your toe. The kid's screaming, whatever it is. But I think the challenge and the difficulty of being someone who is racialized in Britain and the US, across the world, is how often that aspect of your identity is presented to you as the core thing that you are, and how that necessarily then penetrates your way that you move through the world and encounter other people. So I wanted that nursery nurse, I suppose, to just be really benign figure. She says hello, that's it. But the way that encounter can be so charged by a context which is itself charged, right? The way that Blackness is something that is like endlessly, or, you know, any kind of non-whiteness, I'm sure, you know, folks who are Asian and, you know, from any other minoritized group, I mean, you know, it's a broader question. People who are trans these days have similar, the way that identity is just constantly put forward as like the most important thing about you, and therefore necessarily influences what you experience, you know, so many social interactions. And what it was like, you know, during the BLM protest to have Blackness just be this, you know, this thing that kind of followed you everywhere, and everybody wanted to know what you thought about it, and therefore you starting to see everything through that lens.
How do you feel about the word woke, in the sense of being Black, you have to be woke? You're woke. There's something about that nursery made you think. You woke. You're aware of something, and that to me is how Blackness works. You're just aware of these things. Often hard to articulate, but you sense it. You sense it. You know, sometimes they say you've got a chip on your shoulder. You know, it's not like that. It's just one sense to protect yourself. In your case, your son, or the son. Sorry, I'm getting the son. I think you brought that well, very strong, very clearly. I just want to move on to the social media. How you brought that in terms of the fact nothing is resolved on social media. You know, no arguments, and you brought in both sides. Talk to us a little about how you decided, you know, the arguments, how they were resolved or not resolved.
I mean, most of them are just direct quotes from actual posts on social media. There's some which are just edited slightly to tone them down so they seem like something more realistic than what people actually write. I think there's no engaging with this issue without thinking about social media. I increasingly think there's no writing about the contemporary moment that doesn't talk about the internet, you know, unless it's intentionally set on a remote island somewhere. And, you know, even then that remote island was to somehow not have Wi-Fi signals or satellite access. We live these days between two worlds. One is on a screen and one is the one that we walk through. Last year, perhaps we lived even more on the screen than otherwise. So any kind of social issue is happening to us, both in our lived experience, but also in our lived experience on screen. So that's why I included it.
I got to say the argument was not resolved. You know, one spoke for Churchill, one spoke against Churchill. That's just the reality of social media. It's all both sides of the argument are always there, and it's never fully resolved. Is that the point you're making here, or am I putting words into your mouth?
You know, I don't really know. I just trying to set this story, which is broadly realist, in a context that feels broadly realist, you know, thinking about Black Lives Matter protests, George Floyd's death, murder.
Okay.
It happened with this cacophony of voices, you know, and I wanted to try to, and this is a part why I said I think things are quite finished. I think this could be refined. I kind of want to represent that, wanted to represent that cacophony.
I think I'll be one of my takeaways, a cacophony of voices. I like that. I'd like to finish off with this question that when you said it, it came across, this phrase came across, it really struck me, and I'd like to give it back to you. You talked about the coming conversation.
Yeah.
Again, what is that coming? What is the coming conversation?
Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Frantz Fanon, The Fact of Blackness, that moment when you realize that you are other, that anyone who is othered experiences, you know. I can speak to real life. I do have a son who's a bit older than the son in the story. And he doesn't understand himself in those terms, but one day he will. And I don't know when it will happen. But I think every single non-white person I have ever met has the story of the day they realized they were not white. You know, someone said something. I've written about this at length before, you know, for people who are in majority sort of non-white countries, I suppose, it happens much later in life when they move to a country that is majority white, and suddenly they're being interpreted through their skin color or their nose shape or their hair texture or whatever for the first time. But it kind of comes to all of us. And, you know, this is a story set in Birmingham. And I think, you know, for many parents, it is a thing that you think about, you know, and you know, in America, they call it the talk, which is specifically about police violence, but there is a similar talk about difference that we all have to have, and thinking about how to frame that with your children in such a way that they don't feel disabled by it. And that's not easy, you know, because you're working with a child's understanding and an understanding of something which is fundamentally unjust that you have to somehow rationalize when it's not rational. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, thank you for that, because I remember my mum giving me a similar conversation when I was first time I came home. Said people said something about me. It's almost a rite of passage. I just want to finish off, but just a few words about the process of going from this object to this story, from the real to the imagined. Is this a valid way of talking of reflecting on a piece? Do you think this is a way history should be taught, or history should be understood? The way of making these works relevant today, or is it just fantasy, just another commission?
History is necessarily imagined. None of us have lived and directly experienced the past, so we experience the past only through projections of images and fantasies and ideas and ideals onto it. So I think this is as valid a way. I think, you know, to say this is valid is to kind of draw a line between imagining it in a fictional story on paper and imagine it in the fictional story of the past that we all are collectively and individually creating. I wouldn't draw a line between the two. I think we only understand the past through ourselves, and we only understand the past through projection.
Well, I want to thank you for that, Malachi. And I guess hopefully we'll come back to some of these points when we talk to the panel about this mediating between the real and the imagined and history. What is history if it's not imagined, and how they work off each other. So I'm going to hand back to Pip at this stage. If she's still there, Pip.
I am. Sorry, just clicking through my mute and camera. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully like a lot of this discussion can carry on after the break. So just before the break, obviously Akeim can't be with us today, but he has given us the music behind it. So I will play that, and then I will leave. After that's done, I'll leave the lyrics to it up on screen during the break so we can absorb that a little bit better. So I will just share my screen now. So hopefully we can all see that. And oops. And hopefully this will play. Please someone let me know if you can't hear it. And I'll leave it to Akeim.
names have been written out. Now our posture has been copied and whitewashed of its original textures. Who came first? In the white world, it will be the white face plastered as gold. Our souls continue to roam, for still the injustice plays out without a witness. We came bearing evolution in our minds and hearts. We left with shackles locked on our form. Love struggles to live here, struggle lives here, waiting for love. Love struggles to live here, struggle lives here, waiting for love. Love struggles to live here, struggle lives here, waiting for love. Waiting for love. Healing, reconciliation, recognition. Just a little notation of our existence makes a difference. Being no names, feticized suddenly, but our praying simply for another's gain. Not good enough to be human, but good enough to be an empty figure, to represent the ascension of our victor. This position you continue to play off the Richter. Can't own the team, but you can play the game. A soul that is restless becomes calm as invisible agent with perfect aim. We are not of the past, we are of the present.
Yeah, so I'll let that sit with you all, and I'll let you have the lyrics up for that. I'm sure Akeim would love to talk about his process, but please look out for the next event we're putting on when we show his whole dance, and you'll hear more about his process and thought process behind that as well. So I'll give everyone a short 5-minute comfort break. So we'll kick off again at 8:20. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a chance to have a quick screen break, quick comfort break, and to sort of absorb those words on screen a little bit more. I'm now going to hand over to my brilliant panelists, so Michael, Malachi, Philippa, and Sarah. And I will let everyone get their cameras up, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Everyone all here, just check that Philippa's internet is working because she was having a little bit of trouble earlier. Yep, we're all good. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to completely step out now, and Michael, let you take over. Again, we've got some poll questions coming up, so we'll get them in as we do. And yeah, hand on over.
Okay, that's good. Philippa, Sarah, I want to continue where I left off with Malachi, in the sense that what Malachi and Akeim have done, they've taken a physical piece and they've created a work which is very different from the media that we started with. And they've imagined some things which are quite different from the original piece. So Sarah, what's your feeling about this idea of taking the real and creating something imaginary? Does it work?
Absolutely, it works. And I think what's going on here, I mean, first of all, I'll say that an event like this is so valuable because it allows the space for this nuanced and complex discussion to take place in, and for everybody to discuss the issues in a way that the polarized, very divisive and limiting format of social media cannot do. So I think very much so that these are contemporary responses that respond to historical objects, to an object that has become a part of British history, and perhaps we'll have time to get onto that, but brings that object into the current moment and makes it real and makes it human and puts the human story, as Malachi said, it's this idea of the human story, which is absolutely vital here. And I think within heritage organisations and certainly within museums and art galleries, the creative response by contemporary practitioners, artists or writers, other creative practitioners, this is so important. And artists can say things that curators are not at liberty to. They can speak from personal experience. They can speak to this idea of a lived experience. And I think this is where the idea of what was Malachi's lovely phrase, the cacophony of voices, this is where the cacophony of voices comes. So yes, absolutely, this is a really important way forward, I think.
Philippa,
I would concur, absolutely. I think art in all its forms is always very fluid and changeable. And I think one of the things that really caught my attention most when I was looking into the history of the original sculpture that our copy is based upon was the fact that even at the time, the artist was putting his own artistic interpretation on and was really trying to create that sense of identity, which was so unusual at the time, and which really did create a lot of change in the wider artistic community and future representations of that type. And I think it's really amazing the way that the artistic pieces, the creative pieces that we've heard today, really further that drawing out of identities and the voices internal, which it's very difficult to do in a sculpture. So I think it's been really fascinating to hear those modern and those fluid sort of ways of bringing that, I suppose, bringing that artistic effort into the modern day and really recontextualizing it within our world as it is now.
I'd just like to explore a little bit about the history. This sense you mentioned that this idea of British history. Is this a piece of Italian history, or is it a piece of British history? Or is this in our head, the way we see the piece? Perhaps Philippa, you could say a few words to that in terms of the history of this piece, the Britishness of the Italianness of it, or is it just history?
I think there's certainly a certain aspect of Britishness in it, in the way that it was an 18th century sculpture that, you know, this was the grand tour. This was what all of the aristocracy were doing. They were going off on their travels across Europe, across Italy, and they were bringing home these treasures from abroad. They wouldn't have been seeing the figures behind the artwork. They wouldn't have been seeing the detailed features, the identities. They would just be seeing an object of art. And I think actually it's really interesting that Akeim seems to pick that up in his lyrics. And at the same time, however, I think at the moment in the current day, this is a very universal topic. As I said, the original statue in Livorno was part of a focal point in the Black Lives Matter campaign, which of course it was a global voice in a way. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of put that into its historical British and Italian context, but also in its modern global context as well.
I like the idea of the kind of the Venn diagram here, where, you know, you've got the Italian history, you've got the British history, you've got the Black history. So, Sarah, you've done a lot of work and you've written on Black people in art. Can you see that working in terms of this Venn diagram? In some ways, history is never owned by one country or one individual. It's a complex, interactive thing.
So over a number of years now, the boundaries and the limitations of national histories have really been shown up to be very limiting. And so historians now are much more interested in global histories, and certainly the history of slavery is a global, a transnational history. So I would say that. I mean, the trajectory and the way in which this particular figure of Ali morphs from its original 17th century context into an 18th century sculpture, which is then reproduced many times, it would seem, and these little decorative, so-called decorative sculptures are then being sold in Britain, and then it seems that there's a number of them. I want to pick up on this idea that in that 18th century context, and Philippa, you showed one of those quotes that you showed, which was about a monument to tyranny. So this was 1799, the quote, and the speaker was horrified by the what he saw in front of him. Now this is a classic expression of abolitionist sentiment, and it comes out of the 18th century. It's an expression of what was called sensibility, so which is very much comes out of the Enlightenment, but these are statements which were commonly made by people to express their horror of the abject trade and of slavery itself as an abject phenomenon. So what's interesting in relationship to British history specifically is the fact that this figure that you have at Burton Hall emerges, or it's reconfigured, has a new life in the 18th century within the context of British abolitionism. So it's a very intriguing, very complex story.
So I'd like to pick up on that kind of the object moving and bring in Malachi again, because I've done work with Malachi on migration, and that was back about people moving about. But here we're not talking about people moving about, an object moving about. And Malachi, do you think that the object moving are just as valid as people moving in terms of spreading stories, of I was going to say creating history, of broadening a country's or people's view of the world? The object rather than the people.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess I have to like be the panelist for writing. I guess that's my official, the ambassador for writing, and of course, you know, the objects the media is front of remedy said that are books, and books move around constantly, and the way that they're interpreted and translated and understood in new contexts opens up people's understanding of the world, closes them down, etc. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating the way that material culture as it is, you know, is as Sarah says, kind of and recontextualized, and the way an object in one place mean something really very different in another place, and then mean something very different as it travels through time, which is another kind of movement. So the way that we're responding to this object, whose provenance we're not 100% sure of, and how that different that might have been, as Philippa presented, when it was originally acquired. And, you know, with a lot of these things, I think this process of interpretation, this is really like a basic thing to say, but it still needs to be said. The process of interpretation says so much about the interpreter, and I think there's so much insight that could be had from the way that an object is read as much as from the object itself.
Malachi, I think you're so important on interpretation, because interpretation opens us up to the word you used earlier, Sarah, nuance. That kind of, those slight or big differences, and the ability to accept them. So I want to bring in you, Philippa, here, because maybe I'm putting you on the spot, because I know you're not a historian, but do you sense the nuances that we're talking about here, the differences in terms of, it's an Italian piece here, it's been translated here by 21st century writers and playwrights to actually create something different, you know, and through that nuance, that, like, I was very struck by the basis, or part of the basis for Malachi's work, when he talked about the enslaved person brought his son, his family, to look at himself, and that scene inspired him to create the story. That small little story that made something different. So, do you see the nuance, the importance of nuance in this object?
Oh, absolutely. No, I tend to see history as being very layered in every respect, and that's especially true with this, because it is layer upon layer. It's the way that every single generation sees it as something different, and it's also the fact that even as each generation sees it differently, there's always that underlying sense that it's the same. So you get William Constable buying it just as it's a piece of fine art, it will go nicely in my collection, to Thomas Aston. He's clearly he was more vocal against slavery than William Constable we have as being on record as being. And yet at the same time, he treated this object in exactly the same way. It's still a depiction of slavery, but it was still kept on display in one of the grandest rooms of his house. He regilded it. So even though his mindset was different, the object was received in the same way. And then today, you know, we're having this discussion and we're coming at it from a completely different viewpoint, a completely modern viewpoint. We are talking about this in this panel. We're creating creative writing pieces about it, but it's going back on display in the same room as it was in William's day, as it was in Thomas Aston's day. And so there's that line of continuity, even though there's been a massive shift across those centuries. It's really fascinating to me.
Oh, I want to pick that up, that concept of interpretation, and talk to you, Sarah, as an art historian in terms of interpretation. How important do you think it is that we should have a 17th century eye to this piece, or have a 21st century eye, or should we have both eyes? How should we see these works?
I don't think we would necessarily have one or the other. I mean, they don't cancel each other out, and I would concur with Philippa that history is very layered, and the role of the curator over, I mean, I was a former curator and I teach curatorial studies, and the role of the curator over the last 20 years has become a very different role, and has shifted from being one that really focused on preserving the precious objects in collections, and that is still very much important, and I'm sure Pip and other conservators would agree, and curators would agree, that collections and preserving objects is very important. But what curators often do now, the general consensus is that the curator is a form of storyteller. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you say about this, Philippa, but the curator is somebody who gives voice to narratives and allows for other voices to enter the arena, whether that's perhaps it's in listening to Malachi's story on headphones, perhaps it's some kind of performance, perhaps Akeim is performing in the space, perhaps it's a QR code where somebody could you know, put their phone up to it and be linked then to a certain other type of interpretation. There are many ways of introducing these different voices into a space like that. So I don't think it's as simple as you know, saying this was the 17th century view, this was the 18th century view. It's much more complicated than that.
And if I could jump in just to piggyback on that, I think it's become really popular now, particularly in the way that these conversations manifest on op-ed pages and newspapers and things like that, to act as if there was a 19th century or 17th century view, as if everybody in the 19th century thought about slavery in the exact same way. And how dare we project our 21st century ideas on there? But there were always abolitionists, there were always people who were against it, there were always people who, you know, there are always manifold opinions as there are now. And I think, you know, there's a huge amount of flattening that takes place to pretend that everybody, you know, in 1805 woke up in the morning with the exact same thought in their head and then conducted their life in, you know, a way that meant they were all univocal. It's a huge distortion.
I'd like to jump in on that and say, actually, I really do agree with that. And I think that's something that I'm becoming increasingly aware of. I'm still very early in my career as a curator, but I'm becoming increasingly aware of the fact that we do tend to draw a very broad brush across different periods and different identities, and we do tend to kind of band them together quite well. And those ideas have an astonishingly strong hold in public perception. It's like the idea that 17th or 18th century England was entirely white, and that the idea of ethnic minorities appearing is a very modern thing, and it's not at all. They've always been here, they've always been part of our country, and yet it's only fairly recently that we've seen their stories starting to be told. It's really interesting trying to bring that out and trying to increase that interpretation within the way that we see history, and that's going very broad. That's going far beyond the scope of this immediate subject. But I think that is something worth bearing in mind, that history is a much more varied place than we tend to give it credit for.
No, I think you're so right, Philippa, because one of the challenges of displaying this piece is there's so many ways into it, and we can take the slavery point of view immediately, but there are other views in terms of an enlightened view that as Malachi's indicated, some people see this as a way, an object of freedom in terms of freeing slaves, others as captive slaves. It brings me reminded of the discussions going on right now in the National Trust in terms of rewriting history, you know, which the argument goes is they believe that you bring in the history of slavery in this instance, you're rewriting history, but so isn't this just another way into an object, another layer of the object? And our job, or job of historians, is to pick up these layers and expose them. Perhaps, maybe not to critique them, that's for someone else to do, but we just talk about them. But there seems to be in this National Trust with what's it called? There's a number of organizations, the Common Sense Group in Parliament, and Restore Trust, that's the Restore Trust, the National Trust, want to go back to almost a single narrative, which is not the way we teach history today, is it? It's much more nuanced.
Absolutely.
And yet, I don't know, I think the problem is that every single collective will have their own rigid point of view. So you will have the Restore Trust saying, we only want the old perspectives. We have other groups saying that we only want the new perspectives. And I think there is a middle ground there where we can explore perhaps the way that we should recognize the way that people have seen history and why they saw history that way. And I think it needs a lot of sympathetic interpretation so that we can sort of marry up and kind of help each side understand each other's point of view. Does that make sense?
Well,
Yeah.
so could you comment on this concept of sympathetic interpretation?
Can I jump in there, because I feel very strongly that history is always under critical scrutiny. It's always being rewritten. The archive is not Well, the archive is deeply problematic, and there are many voices that archival records that are not in the archive, and obviously within the context of this conversation, Black history often is absent and invisible from that archive. And what many historians are doing, and that obviously that doesn't mean that Black history didn't take place. We all know, of course, that that's a lunacy. So history is always being revisited, and by historians and by societies, and often, I mean, the societies look at history and take from history what is often useful in the present moment. So the idea that history is X is a nonsense. I mean, let's just say that, because this idea that these histories are taking something away from a history that other people think exists as such. These are not histories or stories that are taking away. These are stories, different people's stories, part of a broader, in this context, British history, a collective British history. These are stories that are adding and yes, maybe, well, shaping and causing us to revisit our common British history. But this is always being done, and museums and heritage sites, country houses, are fantastic places for these kinds of broader discussions to take place.
So you saw on the money in terms of many people to often see history as a zero-sum game. If one group advances, another group retreats. But it's much more complex. And I wouldn't use the N word here. It's much more nuanced, and it's accepting that. But Malachi, come on, you want to make a comment?
It's a tiny thing. I think, just to respond or to add to what Philippa and Sarah said, I think there is an interesting, and this is from, again, my experience in my previous commission looking at Cork Abbey. There's a unique way that country houses and historic houses are presented as kind of frozen in time. And I think it feels like it's only very recently that curators and the people responsible for the collections there are revealing the amount of preservation and ordering and curation and thought that goes into creating these spaces and making them look the way that they are. In a particular case of the National Trust, I think that is kind of disrupting perhaps people's understanding of these things. Some houses, certainly Cork Abbey, presented itself for a very long time as, this is the way we found it. Come in and look at this great house of this great family. But of course, that's not the case. Like, there's so many things that have been moved around, things that have been preserved or not preserved, things that are presented in a way or not presented in a way. But I think the way the country houses function is kind of indicative of the way that a lot of people experience history in Britain as something that, to an extent, is fixed. And what is happening with people trying to add new voices is a disruption of something that is fine and solid and concrete. So putting more information in country houses is making them not what they are. It's making them something curated. When they're not curated, they are history. And I think it's kind of revealing the wizard behind the curtain, I think, in the way that history works, and country house in particular work, which would help all of this stuff move on a bit more from where it seems to be stuck.
There's a popular mantra from the Department of Culture about retain and explain. Particularly when they're talking about some of these statues, they should be put there. And this retain and explain, particularly explain. Now, Philippa, I'll put you on, maybe I'll put you on the spot here. Talk to me a bit about how you see that explain bit, your mandate to explain. How does that work?
I'm going to start off just by telling you something that might seem irrelevant, but it's something I saw on TripAdvisor when I was looking at the statue in Livorno, it made me laugh, because it was someone who was absolutely horrified by the statue and said it shouldn't be out in a public place, it should be in a museum. As if suddenly, if you put something in a museum, it's utterly harmless and it's just an object of art that's irrelevant. It's historical, that's it, it's gone, which was fascinating to me. But yes, I think, as Malachi says, historic houses tend to be seen as very fixed, and certainly at Burton Constable, that's something that we tend to do. We we tend to try and keep it looking like a family home, and it does feel a little bit trapped in aspic sometimes, although I'm starting to try and breathe a little bit of life into Burton Constable again, doing various little things like introducing artificial greenery and just trying to make the house feel slightly more alive and trying to increase the amounts of different interpretation. But we're particularly blessed at the moment in that we've got new forms of interpretation coming through. Sarah mentioned QR codes, which is something so unobtrusive, but it immediately opens the vista for written interpretation, audio interpretation. It means that we can let people stand in our spaces and watch with headphones pieces of art or dance or music, or listen to interpretive creative writing, or anything that we want to be able to let them hear, and yet it doesn't impede on the people around them. And that means that we can tell these layered histories a lot better. We can tell the different points of view. We can say why everything is interpreted as it is, and perhaps start to give a peek behind the curtain at how we make the decisions that we make and the difficulties that that presents. I think we're living in a really exciting time for historic house curators, and it's really fascinating to be able to take part in an event like this, because I think every event like this opens that curtain a little bit more and allows a little bit more exploration.
Thanks for that, Philippa. Sarah, I'm going to give the last word to you on this retain and explain. How important is this explanation, and how should it be done? Is QR codes the way ahead? Are there other ways you can see these pieces being explained?
Well, I mean, explain is another word for interpretation. I mean, look, it's obviously a very toxic political environment that we're all working in. That does need to be said, and that's a very unhelpful environment, I would say. So the retain and explain, I mean, that comes as a response to the pulling down of Colston. So what the topic that we've been talking about tonight is the questions about, well, the statue of Ali is being conserved, and then how and when and within what context to show that statue. That's the key focus here tonight, which is rather different. Yeah.
No, sorry, I disagree with you so fundamentally, because it's about an object's there on display, and the people talked about it, responded to it earlier. What was it? The number of people said that there was some trauma in the piece. They were concerned by the piece. So it's within Burton Constable's remit to say, well, this is too distressing to have on display. We'll put it behind.
Yeah.
So where I'm coming from is this piece it's got to be on. Well, I'm putting words into your mouth here, but it should be there, and we should look to ways to explain why it's there.
Right. So
or interpret. Use your word, interpret.
Okay. I mean, look, in my view, an object like this, and this would go for the many paintings, oil paintings from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that are hanging in museum and gallery basements and haven't been seen because they're deemed to be and are in many respects offensive. So these objects, these difficult objects, should be seen, but they should be contextualized very sensitively. And I think some of the debate tonight, I think, is showing some ways in which that kind of interpretation and contextualization might be able to move forward. But I think what would be very sad is if objects like Ali stay hidden away in storerooms and are not seen and are not therefore the subject of discussions like the one tonight. I mean, the challenge, I think, for places like Burton Hall is to bring all the nuance and complexity of this long, 2-hour panel session tonight into that space in some way, and that is a challenge. But I think if we're not having those conversations, that is would be the greatest danger.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for that, because it's an ongoing debate, but the fact we're having it now is part of the fact that we're part of a much bigger conversation. And on that, I want to hand back to Pip to get some more input from our audience.
Hi, sorry, there's always a bit of delay on me opening up my video. Yeah, I mean, we could carry on these discussions for hours and hours, but I'm aware that everyone's already been staring at the screen for 2 hours, and yeah, we really want to sort of bring a few sort of audience participation bits in here as well. So first, let's get a word cloud up. So I think, Rachel, we've got a couple of word clouds. So if we just get the one about what understanding people have taken so far. So if we again just have a little, same as last time, just get your phones and your cameras out. Talking about QR codes, we'll just be using them everywhere. So it should flick through in a second. Okay, so yeah, if everyone can pop down sort of a word that you've undertaken, understanding that you've taken away from today's event. Again, there's been so many different angles that we've looked at. Again, that could be either an understanding from the panel discussion we've had about curatorship, or it can be about the creative responses as well. Just to kind of get sort of like a picture of what we've taken from so far. So yeah, there's a lot about context and layers. Yeah, narrative, individuality. So again, I don't know if the panelists want to sort of discuss some of these words that are coming up. Just very quickly.
I think it's really interesting to see that layered and layers has actually come up twice, and that nuance has come up twice. So clearly those aspects of our discussion are the ones that have really, they're the only ones that have been repeated there, which is really interesting, that kind of recognition of the importance of that aspect of recognizing the layers in history and the nuances that we need to bring to interpreting this sort of object.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Philippa, because that word, that nuance, really came home to me when Sarah brought it up. But then you drift into interpretation, you know, putting it in context and peeling the layers behind a work. But it takes a certain strength of character, a confidence in yourself to do this. You know, so I guess this means our tendency to be better informed, better educated, or equally, the QR codes need to be able to bring in all those different layers or different contexts for the work. So maybe there's work to be done in how we present the work, not just one way into it, but the other way is there are other ways in actually into the piece. Because something we didn't talk about in terms of the sculpture, the physicality of the sculpture. It's quite an exquisite object. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the myths behind the object. You know, is it really a slave, or is it the north, south, east, and west, or is it the four corners of the earth? Look at different ways into the piece. So no, I think that's it's more work for you to do, Philippa, there to kind of bring all these layers out.
It's exciting. It's definitely exciting. It's a good challenge.
I'll just say very quickly on that point, but because I know we're coming to the end here, but there is a tension in that sculpture, I feel, between the individuality of the character. And so I would be wanting to know, if I were researching it, are we able to find anything in the archive about that individual? But what also needs to be acknowledged is that those individuals do get subsumed by the symbolism of those four Moors. They're the four Moors, aren't they, in the original sculpture? And those four Moors take on this hugely significant or symbolic significance. So there is an interesting tension, but whether or not anything specific can be found about Ali, and if that would be the case, I would think that absolutely first and foremost needs to be given as information next to that sculpture, because that would be really important.
There's a great question just come up from the audience, and it's multi-layered, so you've got to be brief. And I'll go with you first, Malachi. It says, do you think we can separate an object from its history? And then, for example, do different copies of the sculpture have different histories? You have less than 2 hours. No, no.
I want to use a visual aid. I think that happens all the time. So like I said, I have a young son who's slightly older than before in the story. He has no idea what this is. He thinks it's really fun to play with, but he doesn't really get what it's for or how it's supposed to work, although he's really good at turning on a smartphone. Objects constantly get divorced from their history. I think, you know, without the effort of actively preserving those histories and passing them on from generation to generation, necessarily get recontextualized, which is, I think, in part why a lot of the debates are. I mentioned Churchill in my story. You know, in his time, Churchill was understood to be racist. Like, and also you can be two things at once. You can be racist and also play the heroic role in World War II. That is possible. But now, because of the decontextualization of the man and his story and his images and so on, we now see him as this sort of blameless person. And having been educated in the United States, the view of Churchill over there is really different, and in particular, the role that he played in World War II. So I think this is a constant process. Things are always getting detached.
So Sarah, a few marks about objects and histories. Do objects have different histories from their copies, or copies have different histories?
Oh, I think every object has its own history. That's a cop-out answer, isn't it?
No, it's a good answer. It's a good brief answer for this time of night, because we're approaching the end. Philippa, your ideas?
I don't think. Oh, it's layered. It's layers again. Yes, this object has its own history. Can you ever truly separate the object from its wider history? Well, no, because if you do that, then it ceases to have any meaning at all. And it doesn't matter who you show that sculpture to. They almost always see a slave. So you can't really divorce that object from its wider history. But its own history, we have very little idea about. So it's a really interesting question.
I know as a chairman I shouldn't have a comment, but I always see is that's part of its history, that complexity, all those nuanced layers. That's what makes the piece. That's what makes it. And the ability for us to have this conversation. So there's not one narrative, there's several. And the thing is, we can accept that. We're open to it. Some people rather fixed in the narrative, they live in a binary world. You know?
But can I jump in there, Michael? Because I just want to say this, that history is not out there something that's on a museum or a country house label, that what we're also talking about is giving people voice to respond in their own deeply personal way. And I think Malachi's wonderful piece of creative writing shows us exactly that really, really well. Yes, it's about history, but he's also talking about living personal experience in the present moment. And I think that's really important for us to remember.
Excellent point, excellent point. Its history informs us today.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good note to finish on. We're just reaching the last couple of minutes, and I think Sarah's last comment about how important Malachi's piece was, and Akeim's as well, to bring these stories kind of home and give a different aspect to it that we don't normally see in historic houses is really brilliant. So yeah, on our last minute, I'd just like to thank everyone. Thank you, Michael, for trying to sort of contain this debate into something manageable within sort of like less than an hour, really. And Sarah and Philippa as well for your inputs, and also an absolute massive thanks to Malachi and Akeim, because without your creative responses, we wouldn't be having this event. So thank you so much for giving us something to work off and something to talk about. So if you want to get in contact or sort of continue this debate at all, you've got the Link Conservation Twitter and Instagram as well, and we can sort of forward any questions that you have. There's also the Burton Constable. Do you want Twitter and Instagram? Just Twitter.
Twitter and Instagram.
Twitter and Instagram.
I have my own curator's account at True Curiosities, or we have at Burton Constable. So always happy to hear from people with thoughts on tonight.
And again, I think the best thing about having something like this, where we have an audience like you to listen to these conversations, is, you know, this is a moving topic, and you know, this directly influences how the sculpture will sort of be displayed and how it will go. So you know, history's for everyone, so everyone needs to get involved. It's not just the sort of like the people that you see at the top of your screen here making the decisions. It's everyone. So again, so thanks, a massive thanks to everyone for attending again, because otherwise without you we wouldn't have an event either. We'd just be having an awkward Zoom meeting. So thanks everyone for that, and I will sign us off.
Thank you very much for organising, Pip.
No, thank you for a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Appreciate you.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye.